Melissa Byrnes will comment on today's papers. She moved from Georgetown University, where she received her PhD in 2008, to Georgetown, Texas, where she's an assistant professor at Southwestern University. She has a number of articles in progress or under review. She has published Liberating the Land or Absorbing a Community, Managing North African Migration and the Bidonville in Paris's Banlieue, in French Politics, Culture and Society, published in winter of 2013. Her book manuscript, Cosmopolitan Identity and Community Activism, Arguing for North African Rights in the Suburbs of Paris and Lyon, is under review, so we truly can look forward to a great spate of new books from these scholars. Melissa?
Thank you. And thank you so much to the panelists for a really fascinating set of papers. I think my task is particularly easy today, given how beautifully these three work together, despite what Louisa just tried to say about her own work. I think it fits beautifully. I want to just raise a couple of connections that I saw, pose a few broad questions to each of the panelists. I actually have many more, but I'll get you later. And then quickly, I hope, cede the floor to discussion. So there are two themes that emerged most clearly as I read. The first is that we get a really detailed picture of how colonial practices moved back and forth between West Africa and the French mainland. I think we all know by now that they did, but here we get some real details, and particularly how fears about the stability of multiracial urban areas crossed across between empire or sort of between the colonies and the metropole. We see this with the individual travels of police officers who are transferring between the two areas. We see this in the anxieties of the French police about the activities of West African labor unions in France. And then we also see this in the guiding principles of urban design in colonial Dakar. The second theme I found was that all three papers really emphasized the degree to which surveillance and control permeated all imperial policies, not even those just linked to policing. And this is particularly through the use of categorization as a strategy. Though that, again, is not necessarily a brand new thing, I think what is newer, certainly clearer here, is how troubling this is given the consistent theme of French misperceptions and misconceptions. So you have police officers who start tracking individuals who actually just mirrored their own vices. We have the insistence on casting African migrants to France as rural and agrarian and therefore susceptible to Maoism. And we also have that belief that African and European populations could be neatly divided into black and white, none of which, as we've seen, worked out very well. So to start off with Kathleen's paper, I really appreciate the move she makes to consider the individual police officers and their motivations. I think this is a great way for us to connect grand imperial structures to actual lived individual experience, which is a project very dear to my own heart. One of the questions I have for you, Kate, is what the French state's interest was in running the system in this way. It's likely that they were also noticing the types of patterns you're seeing. And so I was wondering, why did they continue to identify or sort of allow these sorts of people to move in this sort of way? Does this actually support some of their imperial goals? Is it just that they didn't have any better ideas of how to do this? I have a wonky related question, and that is, how did this actually work bureaucratically? Like, how do they move between ministries? Are they going from Interior to Colony, Minister of the Interior to the Ministry of Colonies? And does that transfer actually partly explain the difficulty in getting promotions and experience recognized? I was also curious to hear a bit more about the broader French policing standards and training at this time, since that's what you really emphasize, that's how they're being schooled, that's what their experience is. I noticed that most of the cases you examined seemed to be individuals who came from Paris, and I wasn't sure if that actually is a trend or just something that showed up in the paper. Whether or not they all come from Paris, or many of them came from Paris, or if they come from all over, I was curious to know if you have ideas about what happens with those who return to France, and the sense of what types of imperial tactics they could actually bring to bear back in the metropole on migrant populations and on autochthonous French citizens. Which of course brings us to Gillian's paper. I think Gillian gave us a really fascinating insight into the willful forgetting of the French Empire by metropolitan authorities. She aptly highlights the fact that continued colonial fear and racial stereotypes were perpetuated even as the source for these and for the actual presence of those West African workers in France, even as that source was ignored. This sense of the continuities between imperial and post-imperial policies and policing begs the question of whether some of the police tracking the UGTSF had actually served in colonial police units. So are some of these the individuals that Kate introduced us to, or the next generation thereof? I also think that there's you discuss the tension between the sort of political agendas and the social welfare programs that Ndongo and the UGTSF had. And you talk about the fact that they're really working by the end to try to fill gaps that the French welfare system was unable or perhaps unwilling to fill for these workers. On the one hand, you give us a sense that focusing on these social issues really helped African labor activists stay clear of the police who were focusing on political agitation. On the other hand, you mention a slightly longer history of West African labor unions concentrating on those sorts of social questions. And I wondered if you could tease us out a bit more and particularly think through the point of view of Ndongo and other African leaders. So how much are they trying to play it safe, and how much are they responding to what they saw was their traditional obligations to fellow Africans? And I think behind that question is sort of a broader question, is how they're linking political and social goals, given that the line between social justice and political activism can be so thin. I think Gillian's discussion of French concerns about African workers living beyond the state's control connects really well with Louisa Rice's examination of urban geography and planning, that both really show that desire by the empire to firmly locate, watch, and control Africans. So, segue to Louisa's paper, which was, I thought, a perceptive and intriguing examination of the contradictions of the colonial system, especially through the way that imagined what she calls neat categories of imperial rule failed completely to capture the complex realities on the ground in Dakar. I wondered if there's room here to maybe interface a bit with Kate's discussion of suspicious persons by asking who was suspect within this urban planning rubric of the modern versus the traditional. I have my own suspicions, but is it poorer Africans? Is it Europeans who are slipping into African areas? Or is it the modernized évolué? Who's sort of suspicious and most problematic? On a similar front, I was curious to know how closely architects and urban planners worked with the police, how much of what they were doing was explicitly requested by imperial forces of order, how much was just sort of the broader air of being in the French Empire and imbibing its ideas of power and necessity. I wondered a little bit about some literal transgressions of this space, like the one, the cart driver in the film you told us about. How were areas of the city linked? How could you get from place to place within Dakar? What neighborhoods were connected? What kinds of transportation was there? What ways, in what other ways was trespassing these boundaries actually made impossible? Finally, you discussed the perceived polarity between two ways of life. Wow, there's a spider. Sorry. That's now, the adrenaline is going. Okay. So you discussed this perceived polarity between two ways of life, a stark division between Europeans and Africans, and I wondered if you could consider a little too how this bifurcation ends up coming back into metropolitan urban planning, particularly in the case of migrant housing, with the design and the operating principles of a lot of the cités de transit. My last question for the panel in general, and I ask this as someone who has relied quite heavily on police archives myself. I'm always curious to know how others navigate the ethical dimensions of using this kind of source material. These are a goldmine of information for us as historians, but I always am aware that they're rooted in a really troubling degree of intervention and the imposition of modern state power. So I'd be curious to hear what you all think of the historian's responsibilities or even possible complicity in this work. And with that, I would like to open up to the rest of the room. Get the dead spider off my notes. I say let them ask.
We have plenty of time. Every one of these presenters has hewed to strict instructions, so there's plenty of time for all of you to ask your questions. So what's your preference?
We can take questions if people have.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. Jillian, first, your concept of racial advocacy. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more if there is like a very explicit sort of anti-racist discourse that you guys, that your guys use, and if so, how that is. And then I had another question about, and I know this is an abridged version of a longer paper, but I thought it was interesting that you sort of moved from the interwar period to post-colonial period, and I was wondering what you have to say about the 50s, because I work on
I work on the 50s and Africans in Paris in the 50s. And there's a lot of organizations, there's a lot of surveillance, that's all sort of there, and sort of how that might change sort of the arc of your story. And Louisa, I loved your paper. I was wondering if there's anything comparable elsewhere. I mean, is there any sense of, maybe we need to do something with Rufisque, or, is sort of the investment or concentration in Dakar at this time sort of part of why a lot of other centers sort of start to decline? So I was just curious about that. Thanks.
Okay, yeah. This is very specifically for Dakar, and as the wider paper would say, it's also about the Cold War, and Dakar is now considered to be of strategic use after World War II in a way that it hadn't really been considered beforehand. So actually the bulk of the investment is going into developing the port and the airport, and then the sort of residential stuff is happening at the same time. So the plan is a lot bigger and is strategic, and I hadn't thought about, which I should, how that might be deflecting investment from other places. But it does, I mean, they talk, there's several discussions of Dakar as the station service of the Atlantic. And it gets compared with Algiers too, I think a little bit in that way. And at some point in the 50s, it's sort of they talk about it after Marseille and Bordeaux, Algiers, and Dakar, so the next places in the Union. So I think it is seen as a special case in this period, at least.
Thank you. Those are fantastic questions. So in terms of racial advocacy, I've thought a lot about this. I did kind of a side article on this. It wasn't something that I addressed entirely initially in the manuscript, although I think based on that article, I've started to put it more in other places. And what's interesting is that in the early 1960s, you really see organizations like the UGTSF and others that are linked to a national identity like Senegalese, talking about welcoming all Africans and talking about advocating for Africans. So they don't really explicitly use terms that we would recognize as racially oriented. They're not really talking about the black population as perhaps we speak about it in the English context, or maybe comparably in the US context in terms of the civil rights movement. But as you move across the 1960s, what's interesting is that you start to see a greater emphasis placed on nationality. So you start to see a focus on Senegalese and on Malian and on Mauritanian, and you start to see more friction between the various groups as those identities, I think, crystallize. And then what's interesting is by the 1970s, especially the late 1970s, after the change in immigration law comes in 1974, you start to see a real emphasis on ethnicity. So on the Soninke population and other groups, all the while there's an emphasis on thinking about the position and place of African workers and students and others within French society more broadly. And they do talk about experiences with racism. They do talk extensively about how they think that the population around them perceives them. And so they definitely speak about experiences with racism, although they don't talk about race in, I guess, as overtly open terms as I would have thought when I first started the research, which I think is pretty interesting.
I guess I meant, are they sort of seeing
structural racism, institutional racism? Are they seeing these social welfare questions as a question of racism?
Absolutely. I think that they recognize that they're not provided with the kinds of housing as maybe even their Algerian counterparts are. I found this one quote where one of the men that I've found in the archives talks about how, you know, they're enslaved even by Algerians. You know, they see themselves as victims of racism from other immigrant groups as well as from the French population. And so that's definitely alive and well in their consciousness. And I do think that they borrow pretty heavily from the Pan-African movement generally and from the Negritude movement as well as the language of independence movements. And so they weave all of that into the language, but they don't talk about race itself as maybe as overtly as I would have thought when I started the process of doing this research. And then as far as the interwar period versus the post-colonial period versus the 1950s, I think when you do any kind of research project, you have to make choices. And so one of the choices I made very early on in my research was to focus almost exclusively on workers, because there was, by the time I started this, some scholarship on the student movement of the 1950s. And I wanted to differentiate myself a bit from that because there wasn't at the time as much scholarship on Black African workers in the 1960s and 70s. So I haven't worked extensively on the 1950s because the majority of workers who come to France in the post-war era come after 1960. But I will say that I have looked at student organizations that were formed in the 1950s, and they do look a lot like the labor unions of the 1960s. So I think if you did kind of a comparative look at student movements in the 50s versus workers' movements in the 1960s, you would see a lot of similarities. And so I think it's a really important question, and I think it's one that I want to look at further. And I think sometimes when you take a step back from your own research, you kind of start to critique it yourself, and you're like, for me, I'm so focused on workers that I haven't spent as much time with students. And so I think that's something that I would love to be able to incorporate in a different project or another project, or maybe, I don't know if I have room in this project actually. I feel like it's full, but it's a great question, very important.
This in some ways actually picks up on what you're just saying, Gillian. The panel, from the title is sort of constructed around these bilateral relations between West Africa and France. And so I was really curious in all three cases about what kinds of broader multilateral relationships and dynamics are at play. I mean, Louisa, you mentioned the Cold War. You've got all these non-French, non-African people running around in the AOF. So you've got planners and technocrats and bureaucrats who circulate through an administrative structure that is not purely bipolar. And so I'm curious about sort of those dynamics and whether you're thinking about those in the larger projects, and if so, how much of this is, how much of what you're seeing is particular to the West African context, how much of it is part of broader imperial dynamics, and maybe not even just French imperial dynamics, but the dynamics of sort of the contestations of empire in the interwar period more broadly, and the sort of disintegration of empires after the Second World War. I know that's a big question, but I'm interested in the bigger kind of trans-imperial and global networks that might be at work too.
I can answer that.
For all of us?
Yes. No, I can answer for myself, but I mean, I would say that what I'm talking about in the interwar period is really part of a global Red Scare, right? And so, that's sort of how I situate it, but then I say, okay, what makes this unique to French West Africa? That's what I'm trying to get at. And the comparison I like to give is that in the 1920s in Vietnam, radical activists were trying to burn down the Governor General's house, whereas in Dakar they were passing out pamphlets, and they were trying to start a syndicate for teachers, and this is what became identified as suspicious activity. So I mean, there is this really big imperial context that's shaping this, and they're saying, okay, you guys need to find your own suspects, you need to find the propagandists, and what they're coming up with is the things that I'm talking about. in terms of the role of foreigners, I think that's so important too. And I mean, when I started this project, you know, I was reading the files of a lot of foreigners, and I said to myself, oh, I can't really use this. It's not what I was looking for. I was looking for French and Africans, and you know, then light went off, and I realized that it's part of a cosmopolitan or maybe more international society that I'm looking at here, and I think the French want it to be this, you know, and so maybe we are reproducing that in a way. We're reproducing this binary, and then we're all saying that it's not a reality, right? Because in some ways the archive is telling us it's how it's supposed to be, but then the reality of it is so much messier, right? Because it's not just that the Red Scare is global, it's that there's new patterns of global migration and things like that that are a big part of this story, in my case at least.
I would say that I feel like I almost work entirely in the context that you just lined out, because so many of the documents that I've looked at are not only talking about West African immigrants, but they're talking about Algerians, and then they're talking about the Portuguese, and they're talking about Spanish workers. And so I spent a lot of time kind of teasing the story of West Africans out of these broader documents, and they're constantly ranking which immigrant groups they found preferable. It was never West Africans, it sort of went European, Algerian, North African, and then West African. And they're kind of juxtaposing them against each other. And then this story, I think, is also very important to frame within the broader context of immigration to Europe after World War II and amidst the 30 glorious years of economic expansion. So you see the British government addressing issues of immigration. The British actually cut off labor immigration much earlier than on the continent. And obviously you see West Germany grappling with Turkish immigration in terms of guest workers who come to stay, which I think is actually the title of a book. And so one of the things that is so difficult, I think, for a post-war scholar of immigration is to focus only on that one nation-state context. And I have a colleague who works on, Jennifer Miller, who works on Turks in Germany, and we've talked so much about how there needs to actually be more conversations between those national contexts, because so often I think we're rooted only in that one place. And so I think one of the challenges of this project is just how do you bring in all of that, but also contain it? And I find that very difficult, because I want to talk about what's going on in West Africa, and I want to talk about what's going on in France, and I want to situate it with Germany and with Britain, but how do you do that? I'm not sure I know. So it's a great question, absolutely.
For me, it's the Cold War, probably the sort of the overarching broader context throughout, and that's not just because these suspicious communist-inspired people are hanging out in Dakar. That's also because I think there's a lot of anxiety among French administrators about what the U.S. thinks of colonialism in this period, and then also how to make it look better in various kinds of ways. But then also anxiety about Dakar being modernized to such an extent that it looks not French but American. And so there's that's kind of a concern as well. So it's sort of, I don't know if it's sort of the third wayism, I mean, maybe partly kind of being produced here, but there's some struggle, not just about independence movements being communist inspired or affiliated, but about what the United States role is or could be, because there are some American documents from this time period too that basically say the same kinds of things, that Dakar is vacuous, that there's no there, right? And that so we should go build our cultural association building, and that would be fine. And in this period before independence, so the French are negotiating that kind of stuff too. So I think and that's also about French power post-World War II in this larger Cold War context.
But also just the extent to which, redevelopment and urban planning is also an imperial project, an empire-wide project after the war. That Dakar is, you said one of 4 poles that, along with Marseille and Bordeaux and Algiers, and that it's not just one city that's the capital of one colony, but it's part of a bigger sort of imperial entity as well.
I think, too, to the point about the Cold War, I think one of the things that's been missing from post-war scholarship on questions of immigration and the relationship between the metropolitan context and the colonial context is thinking about the Cold War more critically. and thinking about it from a global perspective. And I see so often a focus on things like integration or assimilation without thinking about how the Cold War shaped decolonization, how it shaped colonial politics in terms of the 40s and the 50s, and then how it really shapes that process of decolonization. And then what does that mean for the post-colonial era? I think somehow, I was talking about this with someone yesterday, somehow the Cold War is over here, and these issues are over here, and there's not enough of an overlap between the two. And so that's something that I've been working on recently to try to bring that narrative more into the project.
Can I ask a question about the police? I'm really worried about your policemen, and I was wondering about the connections of the police. These policemen came from Paris, and I wondered about their relationship to the police force in Paris, since they seem to have been drawn for that reason. And these poor guys seem to be a bit unconventional in terms of their personal lives, and they don't have higher education, and they don't have good training, and yet you suggest that they're going for career enhancement, which doesn't pan out. And I wondered whether really it's career desperation in a way. And I also wondered how they saw themselves in relation to other people who'd gone from France and likely had gone from France for many of the same reasons, whether they identified with other Frenchmen in the colonies who were equally without advantage at home.
This is a wonderful question, and I wish that my sources were richer on these questions, because I'm really working with these personnel files that give, the next, and this maybe responds to Melissa's questions as well, the next step for me maybe is to explore in greater depth the secondary literature on policing, to try to put them into that context. There's a language to the levels of, police, all the different positions they can have in the police that are still, new to me. But to kind of maybe to try to find through the Minister of the Interior, right, the archives I've been working at are the Colonial Ministry, and so really the file begins with their first paper saying they've been integrated into the Colonial Service. And so to know what was happening with them in the police service before then is really kind of a mystery to me. And so that's certainly a direction for future research, and to find out sort of what they thought of their experiences is something that I don't know if I can ever really know. I don't know if I can ever find sources like that. It's much more common for the kind of career administrators from the colonies to have documents or letters or things like that. But for these men, I certainly haven't found it so far, but it's something to possibly through the police in Paris, now that I have more information about them, to sort of start looking in that direction as well. But you'll have to hold off in suspense for now.
Larry?
You can answer this question. How well do the police techniques and categories of who is suspect in the Cold War, both domestically and, let's say, in Dakar, match up with police techniques and category of who is suspect and dangerous in, let's say, the colonies in the 1880s or 1890s? Are they the same? Do they map exactly? That seems to me, trying to answer that would tell you what's new in the Cold War, what's modern by the post-war period, and how much has stayed the same.
Well, I can tell you that what I see in my work is a fairly dramatic shift from foreigners as being suspicious to this new, so between the 1880s, so maybe the 1890s more like would be a possibility, into the First World War. It's, you can see it in the inventories of the documents, surveillance of foreigners, especially the Lebanese and the Syrians, right, who were merchants and who were considered a transient class and considered very problematic and troublesome for a variety of reasons. And then, so surveillance of those foreigners, a lot of it having to do with health and this kind of thing, then health, or also hygiene, I guess they would say. So hygiene sort of includes health, I guess. Then during the First World War, it's foreigners, especially Germans, okay? So enemy nationals, Then after World War I is where I see this really decisive break, where it switches from surveillance of foreigners to surveillance of suspects. And instead of being lists of people who are categorized as being, either healthy or not healthy, or either a enemy national, or there was a system of like the red card was the enemy national, yellow was if you were like neutral, so there was this kind of system in place. And then there's this proliferation of literal surveillance, which is, I'm talking about like following around a particular person. He had champagne in this place, he got this in the mail, he's talks to this person, he might be doing this, he's in a yacht off the coast, right? So we see this kind of like proliferation of detailed files on people that tells me something really new is happening in the interwar period. And then, just to continue, then there's another break that comes at the end of World War II, where suddenly all the surveillance files are about public meetings taking place. There were 100 people here to hear this political speech, and there's a complete text of the speech, right? So now it's no longer just suspects being individual, potentially radicals, but now it is a huge mass movement of new politics that I decided not to pursue because it's just a totally new political scene, but I can really see some clear breaks in terms of the chronology there.
Any other questions? Right. I'd like to thank the panel for a fascinating set of papers. Thank you. Thank you.